All right, doctors, welcome. I wanted to talk about wills versus trusts. As we know, there are a lot of Americans out there, including many of our folks that are watching today, James, that do not have a will or a trust. I have with me today James Jamison, an attorney who's done wills and trusts for my clients in the past. I want to talk, James, a little bit about, when does someone get a will? When do they get a trust? If they don't have children. Let's first talk about who wants to have a will, who wants to have a trust.
That's a great question, Vince. In terms of when you get a will or a trust, it's something that you want to have early on in your life, even if it's just a simple will, directing who's going to take charge of your children or end-of-life directives. Those are things that are fairly inexpensive for any person to get, and something that you should immediately be thinking about once you've moved into the stage of having a family.
Now, if I don't already have an end-of-life directive, I'm incapacitated, something's happened to me, well, what's default? What if I don't get one?
Well, I think everyone can relate to that in terms of what was in the national media several years ago in Terri Schiavo. And that kind of thing is what happens, where you get competing interests that try to decide who's entitled to make your end-of-life determinations without your ability to have some input. That's why you really want to have something like that in place.
Okay, and then to go further, I also then want to have some directives as to who's going to take care of my children. Okay, talk about that, and talk about the will. And
that's correct, and you can have a very basic will, or you can have a more complex will, depending on what your assets are. A very basic will just dispose of your property, give a directive as to who the guardian of your children should be, and then provide some end-of-life directives along with it. That's a very basic will. Then if you've got additional assets that you need to deal with, there are different things that you can do in your will to address those, or you can have a trust in place in order to manage those assets as well.
And a lot of people, you hear about probate, they've heard about the costs associated with that, the confusion, also in a matter of making it private. I'm a business owner, I've got some assets, I have a $200,000 business, I've got a home with some equity, I've got some things that were handed down to me. Is a will going to keep that private?
The answer to that is no. Whenever you have a will, you're going to have to go through the probate process in order to have your assets disposed of underneath it.
So anyone can see it?
Anyone can see it. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about what some of the differences are then between a will and a trust, so that we can figure out if that's something we want.
I'm going to trade you here.
Yeah. Got a will, and then you've got a trust. And a will is a testamentary document, and it goes into effect at the time of your death. A trust, however, doesn't have to be a testamentary document. You can have a trust in existence for the duration of your life that then also provides a vehicle for disposing of your assets at the time of your death. The nice thing about that is that it gives you life control over your assets, and at the same time, a vehicle for them to pass on death.
Now, am I going to have a separate tax return for this? Am I going to have to, anytime I buy something, buy it in the name of the trust? How much work is that going to be to fund it?
It is some work in order to fund and to manage that. It operates like a separate entity, and you have to treat it like that. You've got to treat it like something that's distinct from you. Even though you have control over it, it's in and of itself a separate entity. Whereas a will, that's something you put together. It just simply is a directive of what your assets are supposed to be done with at the time of your death. So you do that, and then it functions on its own at the time of your death.
Okay. Now, do I want both, or am I going to choose either or? And then finally, kind of talk about range. I realize every case is different, but range and price.
Sure. The best combination is to have a lifetime trust that then is disposed of through your will. So you maintain control of the trust during the course of your life, and then there's a pour-over provision, is what it's called, in your will that allows for all of the trust property to be put into there and then disposed of in that way. That's the combination that you can have between the two. Or you can simply have a trust that exists that you manage for the lifetime, and then you have a successor trustee. that's appointed. And so you can have the combination of the two, or you can separate them out and only have the trust. For a very basic will package, to talk about that, that would cost you around $500. That's going to get you disposition of your assets at the time of death, it's going to get you an end-of-life directive, and it's going to get you a guardianship appointment for your children. The basic things that people are thinking about.
If I'm on a low budget,
you're on
get
a low
it done.
Budget,
it's going to be public.
You can do it.
It's going to go through probate, but it's my directives.
Exactly.
Not a court, not people fighting over what should happen if something happens to me.
Exactly. You'll have it in place.
Okay.
If you've got more substantial assets that you're looking at.
I've got a vacation home, a business, I've got 401ks, different assets, okay.
Exactly. Then you want to be looking over here at the trust. That's what you want to focus on. And you can have a trust. We do trusts that range from anywhere $2,000 to $3,000 for those types of assets, all the way up to dealing with multi-million-dollar estates. Those will run you $5,000, $6,000 for the complexity that you need for that kind of a trust. So that gives you kind of the range of what you're looking at.
And then a word on these, a lot of people, I'm sure you've heard this before, and Trey, I've heard it with my clients. Oh, I've got my assets in a trust, and they're creditor proof, no one can touch it. And it's just, just a regular revocable trust. You're going to see in a typical, document like this, are you going to see anything that's going to give any asset protection?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. You could include provisions in trusts that create asset protection for your assets that are in the trust, so that those special provisions will, while they limit some of your control over the asset during the course of your life, it's not going to eliminate it. You're still going to have control over that asset. It's going to provide a shield and a barrier for creditors. Wonderful asset protection vehicle the trust is.
Right. Okay, thanks. So, folks, as you look at whether or not you should have a will or a trust, the question isn't so much, do I create my own documents? The question is, which type of documents, what type of planning you ought to have, because most Americans have not taken the time to do this, and for hundreds or maybe even a couple of $1,000s, they get the documents that work. And then in terms of updating them, how often are you updating the documentation for most clients?
For a will, you're going to look at updating that probably every 5 years. For a trust, you really want to measure that based on whether or not you're adding significant assets to it. That you don't have to manage as frequently as you would even a will, if you're transferring the assets into the trust in the proper manner. But if you have a significant asset that you need to move into the trust, you really want to make sure that you're doing that right with your lawyer.
Right, and then first step in doing this, James, if somebody wants to get started with something like this, they fill out a form, they will send it back. How much time is going to be involved in them actually going through this process?
It can be a relatively swift process. For something very basic like that, you're looking at 3 days to a week from the time that you're providing information to your attorney to the time that you're going to have the documents right there ready to sign.
And then their time, in terms of how much time they're going to put into giving the information, they're going to fill out some forms or so forth or have a discussion. How long do you think they ought to budget to put time aside to be able to create these?
To be able to fill out the questionnaire on the will aspect of that, I would allot probably about an hour to go through that and to answer those questions, and then it's going to be another hour meeting with your attorney, and it's that simple. For a trust, it's going to be dependent upon the scope of your assets. If you have some significant ones, you may be looking at a couple of hours of gathering together the information that you need, and then probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours with your attorney, making sure that everything's squared away.
So folks, as James says, we're talking about 2 to maybe 5 hours to be able to have the directives so that your loved ones are not dealing with mayhem, but they're dealing with your instructions at the end of the day.